Today is the last day of the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. As we saw in the video, this is a holiday commanded by the Torah, celebrated for a week. It is a harvest celebration, but also a holiday that commemorates the time the Israelites spent wandering in the desert. I don't know if you remember or how well you remember the story of Exodus and its aftermath, but after the Israelites escape from slavery in Egypt, leaving behind the destruction of the plagues and of the Red Sea swallowing the Egyptians, they head out into the desert. Out there in the desert, the relationship between God and the Israelites gets worked out. There's a whole story where the Israelites literally build a golden calf to worship instead of God, and God gets super mad. The Israelites at one point get whiny about the lack of food and water, and again, God gets super mad. Eventually, they establish or really reconfirm the covenant that will bind them. God gives the people the 10 Commandments. The people promise to follow God alone. Together, they create a whole system of religious and social organization with tribes and priests. And God says, essentially, see that land over there, that's yours, in spite of the fact that people are living there. He tells Moses to get together 12 spies to send out to check out this land, the land of Canaan, in preparation for taking it from the people who live there. The spies go and they get one look at the society that's there, and they take a look at its people and they get scared. They worry the Israelites won't be able to overtake these well-established Canaanites. So when they get back to the encampment, 10 of the 12 spies insist on lying and telling the people that giants live in the land, and they definitely shouldn't listen to God and they should not invade. And so the people collectively decide to not try to go and take Canaan. And as you might guess, God gets super mad again at this lack of faith in God's ability to enable them to oust these other people. And this time, rather than sending a plague or yelling a bunch, God decides that the punishment is that the Israelites, who only recently were freed from bondage in Egypt, will spend 40 years wandering the desert before they're allowed to take the land of Canaan that's been promised to them. And also, all of the spies, except for Joshua and Caleb, are smited for their disobedience, lack of faith, and betrayal. The point of the 40 years is to essentially clear out a generation. Those who will see the promised land are those who were children when they left Egypt, those who were born to the people in exile. They are those who didn't betray God. It's a fascinating story. After freeing the people, God then forces on them 40 years of exile. In reading various analyses of this story, I came across one that commented on how easily the people could have established themselves elsewhere. 40 years is a long time. They could have taken this mistake they made, the lying and the betraying of their promises, and just like thrown in the towel, broken their covenant with God, said, forget it. Who wants to spend 40 years in exile? They could have just become nomadic people or carved a life in the desert and stayed, or been absorbed again into another community. But the Israelites don't find an alternative. They do it. They spend 40 years wandering around, figuring out how they want to organize themselves, figuring out who they are, building their collective identity, and eventually they take the land of Canaan. That story of conquest is a story and analysis for another day. The point today is they wait and they wander and they struggle in the hope that the promises their God made will come through and they'll find a permanent home after this time of temporary shelter. This year, as Sukkot marks the exile, marks the time spent in temporary shelters, waiting for a time of certainty, I'm most struck by that piece, by this idea that they persevered. They didn't beat themselves up for their mistakes. They moved forward, recommitting to the promises they had made. They had a vision of their future, a vision given to them and confirmed to them by their God, a vision of a homeland, a place of permanence, and they made it their business to find a way to that future, even when it was hard, even though it asked a lot of them. They didn't take the easy way, they took the uncertain one, in part because the alternatives posed a high risk to their safety and identity. Staying in Egypt as slaves was, of course, no choice. And being absorbed into another community or culture would have likely meant the loss of selfhood and the loss of self-determination. So they stuck it out. Sukkot is a joyful holiday, a celebration of nationhood that transcends borders and country names, a celebration of permanence in impermanence, of beauty and joy even in exile. It's an extension of the struggle to be free from bondage as slaves in Egypt, and it's a celebration of the desire to make it through from slavery to once more having a homeland that is safe. These days, it's also a reminder that the seemingly unending anti-Semitism in our world means that the Jewish people often find themselves in exile. Those 40 years were not the first years of wandering, and they weren't to be the last. Sukkot happens all over the world, in Jerusalem and in the diaspora, and for all its joy, it is also a time to remember the temporary nature of all things. The holiday itself is fleeting. 7 days of living and eating and gathering in a booth outside, 7 days of knowing that in the end you can go home. 7 days of joyful, if a bit difficult, change from your normal routine, to evoke 40 years of challenge and strife and doubting and resistance and commitment and confusion, and eventually the creation of a new home. All of it grounded in promise and hope, and in some ways, all of it born from necessity, from the necessity to leave where you were and seek safety. In 2009, the poet Warsan Shire wrote a piece that would become the basis for one of her famous poems titled Home. Shire is a British Somali poet who began to craft this particular piece after visiting a refugee camp. I'm not going to read you the entire poem. It's a bit long and also contains a lot of graphic and challenging imagery, but it is beautiful, and I encourage you to look it up if you feel comfortable. Instead, I will share just small snippets this morning. Shire writes, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled means something more than journey. No one leaves home until home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave, run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here." I remember first reading that poem nearly 10 years ago. It circulated on the internet, I'm pretty sure, before it got picked up by a publisher. It's a striking, gut-wrenching articulation of what it means to voluntarily, if you can even really call it voluntary, leave home because there's no choice, because the hope and promise of something else so outweighs the reality of home in that moment, because the possible danger of the journey, of the wandering, is so much less scary than the known danger of staying. I've been thinking a lot about the generations of immigrants who struggled to make their way to America's border, risking their lives and their children's lives because home was no longer viable. Some of those narratives we glorify, perhaps those of our own ancestors, how they came here looking for better lives and made it good, how they were brave and struck out and did what they had to do to survive. And I've been thinking a lot about the recent waves of immigrants from Central and South America fleeing violence and horrors we can barely begin to imagine. Folks who were then sent by the governors of Texas and Florida without consent, it seems, to Martha's Vineyard, Washington, D.C., New York, Illinois, and elsewhere, tricked onto planes and shipped off. That move is not without precedent. Under Bill de Blasio's mayorship, housing vouchers were given to the homeless in New York City for use in renting apartments in Newark. Back under Giuliani, homeless were arrested en masse if they were any outstanding warrants for anything, not even very thinly veiled effort to get folks to self-deport before they were arrested. And there are stories from other cities, other towns, of how they've worked to move along people in need because the budget can't handle it, or the residents of the city or town don't want to have to be exposed to people whose lives are different from their own. This country of ours has a long and pretty infamous history when it comes to moving people. I know Michael spoke last week about what it meant to move people off of their homeland. And we have a pretty long and infamous history when it comes to attempting to deprive people of their rights to shelter and care. We're not alone in this. All across the world, there's a refugee crisis. Civil wars, violence, unrest, economic depression force people from their homes, seeking a better life, a safer one in which their children might know a childhood. And all across the world, the question of what to do with immigrants and refugees remains alive. We've all seen footage of refugee camps, heard of countries tightening their immigration laws, strengthening their borders, however movable and invented those borders are. We here in the United States stood largely idly by while children were separated from parents at the border, while walls were built, while folks were deported, while lives were threatened. All around the world, we draw these lines of nation, of geography, of culture, of whatever we can think to draw a line of. And then we try and keep each other out, push each other aside, ignore each other. While many of us may not be voting for such policies or directly enacting them, most of us end up trying to find ways to avoid the whole thing. It is, we know, sometimes hard enough just to live our own lives, especially these past couple of years. So too often we look the other way, even though we know our values teach us differently. Decades ago, in the state of New York, a court case established that every single person has a right to shelter. This case was based on the language of the state constitution, which says that the aid, care, and support of the needy are public concerns and shall be provided by the state. That language echoes the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which, in more detailed fashion, says this in Article 25. In point 1, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. And in point 2, motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. All children, whether born in or out of wedlock, shall enjoy the same social protection. The language kind of gives away its era. Although the UN claims this right, New York is somewhat unique among states in our nation. Massachusetts seems to have such a statute pertaining only and specifically to families. And California has an allowance for children being able to go to shelters without parental approval. It's perhaps noteworthy that both of these recognize the need to care for children who are thought to be innocent. But this universal right to shelter is somewhat special, and it undercuts a lot of our contemporary and inherited American cultural norms that lean heavily onto the idea that if folks are homeless, they must have done something to deserve it. That if folks are without shelter, they should just work harder to figure it out. Bootstraps, people, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. This New York State law and the UN declaration that underscores it instead suggest that it is the work of the government to ensure that each person has shelter, as shelter is a basic fundamental right. That even those in exile, those who have become refugees, those who have left home by choice or by necessity, all of them have a right to be housed. And that that right should be met by the state, whether temporarily or permanently. The current mayor in New York City, Eric Adams, suggested that perhaps this law should be re-examined in light of the influx of immigrants since May, many of whom were sent by the governor of Texas. It's one more instance of trying to solve a problem by evading it. Immigrants being moved from one state to another is an attempt to pawn off a problem on someone else, while trying to reinterpret the Constitution and earlier court cases is an attempt to legalize looking the other way, legalize apathy, legalize inaction. I am deeply aware that the language even I am using to describe the situation as it stands comes perilously close to speaking about humans as though they were a monolithic block of goods or animals. I hear it. The governor of Texas shipped some immigrants up here. Where can we house them? Evading a problem. When we talk about immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, folks in exile, folks who've come from somewhere else for whatever reason, or even folks born and raised next door who find themselves in need of assistance, we can so easily move into language that dehumanizes, into language that others, the living, breathing people at the heart of the situation. I think in part we do this because we want to think that we are far from it. We want to think that what happened to them couldn't happen to us, wouldn't happen to us. Our homeland would never become violent or unlivable. We would never lose our security and find ourselves on the streets. That's what we want to think. We want to put some distance between us and a life we can't imagine. No one imagines that life. No one longs to be a refugee. No one longs to lose their homeland or find themselves at the mercy of another in trying to secure basic fundamental human rights. Shire reminds us of that so eloquently. No one leaves home until home becomes the mouth of a shark. And no one imagines it until it happens, and it can happen anywhere to anyone. And the language that dehumanizes the immigrant, the refugee, the unhoused, it also works to dehumanize us because it draws those lines. It creates that space between us when indeed we know there isn't any. When indeed we know, as Hewitt said in our opening words, that no branch is utterly severed from the tree of life that sustains us all. He says we cherish our oneness with those around us and the countless generations that have gone before us. When we treat immigration, the refugee crisis, and the needs of the unhoused as budget problems to be solved or issues to be shipped off to some other state or city or even country, we deny the interconnectedness of us all. We deny our shared humanity. We lessen ourselves and we fall short of our values. Shire's poem works hard to remind us of the very deep humanity behind these issues that become politicized and monetized. People don't leave home unless they have to, unless home has become unrecognizable and unsafe, unless home has left them with no other choice. And the choice to leave home does not make them any less than human. Immigrants, refugees, those in exile, the unhoused, each and every one is a human being with inherent worth and dignity, with a right to education, shelter, clothes, food, medical care, and social services. Each one has an interior life about which we know nothing, has family, relationships, social ties, dreams, hopes, needs. Each and every one is part of the family of humans that we belong to as well. To behave, to vote, to use our money as though anything less is true is unworthy of our deepest hopes and broadest visions for this world. Since July of 2021, a 12-foot tall puppet named Amal, which is the Arabic word for hope, has been traveling the world. The puppet takes 4 puppeteers to manage. Wherever she journeys, she's greeted by special events and regular folks who come out to see her. We went, actually, a couple of weeks ago when Amal was in New York, to an event on the High Bridge, which is a walking bridge that connects the Bronx and Manhattan high above the Harlem River. Amal is a puppet of a Syrian refugee, a girl. And although, of course, she doesn't talk, the motions and emotions that the puppeteers are able to achieve are compellingly human. You could see her fear at walking across such a high bridge, her determination to take each next step. Amal, this puppet, this living piece of theater and art and social conscience, works against the dehumanization we fall into so easily, and instead brings to life a child whose future was changed forever when she had to leave home, and who carries the fear, the trauma, the promise, and the hope of a different life. We know how to feel compassion. Our imaginations and our empathy know no bounds, as long as we refuse to shut them down or turn them off. as long as we insist on seeing the individuals, not the bottom line, as long as we remember that all of this really is temporary. During Sukkot, a booth is built with walls and a roof, but it is a roof that lets in the sky. It can't be fully sealed. You have to have a view of the stars at night, a way for the rain to enter, if only slightly, a way for some sun to shine in, a way to see beyond the small square footage of your temporary shelter. You have to be able to connect to the rest of the world, its wholeness and its hugeness. There's an evocation, as there often is in ritual celebrations, of our connection across time and space. And there's a reminder of our finitude, how once we were in exile and found temporary shelter and eventually created a home again. Nothing is permanent, however secure it may feel, and we owe to each other help, support, aid, and care when it is our turn in exile. We owe to each other keeping the promise of our shared humanity, enabling hope in each other's hearts always. We spent a lot of time this fall reminding each other what it is to be part of a community like this, what we desire to give and receive. The thing is, all of those same things are needed out in the world. Our ongoing compassion, and beyond that, our commitment to making change with our votes, our money, our time. We have to promise each other not to look the other way, especially not now when we're reminded of what it means to be wandering in the world. We have to recommit to understanding what's happening right now with the unhoused in our villages and cities and with refugees coming from far away. We have to learn more, get involved, find organizations to support. This community that we share is solid, though temporary, as all things are. And the time has come to turn again to the wider world and make the changes we know we can. Mindful of our finitude and of all that we are so capable of doing, we give thanks for the shelters we are privileged to have, for the communities of care, for the solidity we know in our lives. And we commit ourselves anew to working for the basic human rights of every member of our wide human family. So may it be.